Well, welcome everybody. Whether you realize it or not, while I'm recording this in Traverse City, I'm actually in Cambodia right now on a mission trip with the Big Life guys. What God's been doing in India and in South Asia is now exploiting into Southeast Asia. So I'm over there checking things out. Actually, I'm meeting a Pointe family, Eric and Leslie Falconer, in Phnom Penh. So pray about the trip that I'm on, and also remember Julie Green and some other staff members and volunteers who are also in Haiti at the same time. We're finishing up today the series called Not a Fan, and from the feedback I've gotten from people, it's been challenging, it's been provocative, and I hope that when the series is done, the challenge with regard to following Jesus does not end. In fact, Joe will be talking at the end of the service about some follow-up things that we're putting in place. So I'm very excited about the Not a Fan series. And you might be wondering right about now, what is up with the auditorium? I mean, you're walking in, there's no chairs, or at least very few chairs, and bed sheets hanging from the walls, and kind of stripped down lighting. Well, we did that for a reason. As I was thinking about this final installment of Not a Fan, there's a big question that we want to wrestle with today. I mean, the big question for the series is, am I a fan or a follower? But today has a different and equally significant question. And the environment itself, the physicality of the room, I think necessitated this kind of environment, because the question is this: is Jesus enough? And I've thought a lot about that question. And one of the questions that's come to me is, how do you even know for sure whether Jesus is enough for you? I remember a couple years ago when I was on my inaugural Big Life trip. We were at a house church up in the northern regions of India, kind of on the China border in the state of Sikkim, and we were packed into this house. And if you think you're uncomfortable right now, we had 20 or 30 people jammed into this room. I had my knees up in my throat, and I'm starting to cramp, and my rear end's falling asleep, and it was not comfortable. I actually leaned up against a wall thinking that would give me some relief, but the wall of the house was so thin, I almost knocked the wall down. Comfortable? Not even close. And yet at the same time, beautiful beyond words. So in this whole conversation about followers and fans of Jesus, Jesus decides to have what Kyle Eidelman, who's the pastor that originally did the series, he called it a DTR conversation, define the relationship. Because at some point, Jesus wanted to know about people back then, and I think about us today, why do people follow him? And so he has this DTR conversation that's recorded in John chapter 6, and beyond the challenging and even confusing teaching in that chapter, which we'll look at, lurks the question, is Jesus enough? And you might recall, because we looked at this in week 1, but in John chapter 6, Jesus is like the hottest ticket in town. I mean, he's drawing record crowds. People are crossing international borders to get to him. But the question is why? And I mean, Jesus pretty much knew. The real reason that people were following him is there was miracles and people being healed and bread and fish being multiplied, and Jesus was kind of their free meal ticket. So he has this DTR, defining the relationship conversation. And so if you want to follow along, this is John chapter 6, starting with verse 48. He says, "Yes, I am the bread of life." And by the way, that I am statement in the Greek language is ego eimi, but what's significant is that in the Hebrew language, that phrase I am, or ego eimi, is Yahweh. Jesus used that phrase that we say in English, I am, over and over. And the Hebrew people, the Jewish people of the first century, knew that Jesus was taking upon himself the name that is so holy that to this day, Orthodox Jews won't even say it. So Jesus said, I am the bread of life. And then he said, your ancestors ate manna in the wilderness. Manna was this bread that God gave them from heaven to feed them during the wilderness years. But he says, they all died. And then he says, anyone who eats the bread from heaven, referring to himself, he said, they will never die. And then Jesus said, I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Anyone who eats this bread will live forever, and this bread which I will offer so the world may live is my flesh. And then the people began arguing with each other about what he meant. How can this man give us his flesh to eat, they asked. So Jesus said again, I tell you the truth, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you cannot have eternal life within you. But anyone who eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise that person at the last day. For my flesh is true food, and my blood is true drink. Anyone who eats my flesh and drinks my blood remains in me, and I in him. Well, we've all been to restaurants before, thank you, and some of them are fancy, some of them not so fancy, some of them have huge menus, and some rather limited, but they all have choices of food and beverage. But here's what I want you to think about, and this in some ways is the point of this whole message. When Jesus is the only one on the menu, his body broken for you, and his blood shed for you, when Jesus is the only one on the menu, that's when you find out whether it's him that you're hungry for. I want to tell you a story about a guy that I hope to meet while I'm in Cambodia. His name is Dav Sang. Dav is one of the leaders in the communist country of Vietnam, which is now starting to open up. But for a period of about 16 years, Dav, as a very committed follower of Jesus, spent about 16 years in and out of prison. He would go out and he would preach the gospel of Jesus. The communist officials would come, they would arrest him, they would beat him, they would torture him for weeks and months and years, and then they would release him. What would Dav do? He'd go back out into the villages, he'd preach the gospel, he'd tell people about Jesus. What would the government officials do? They'd arrest him, they would beat him, they would torture him, and this went on and on for 16 years. And finally, at the end of 16 years, with the communist government not really knowing what to do with this guy, they finally decided to release him. But it wasn't just releasing him, they had done that before. The crazy thing that happened is they released him and they gave him a certificate from the government to preach the gospel of Jesus. Apparently what they discovered is that when they brought Dav into prison and they beat him and they tortured him, the vibrancy of his faith was so strong that he kept leading prisoners and prison guards to a relationship with Jesus. So they concluded Dav was more dangerous to them in prison than he was out in public. So they just wanted him to go away, go do your thing, we don't want to deal with you anymore. For Dav, Jesus was all he had. And for Dav, Jesus was enough. But it isn't just people like Dav, people who are faraway people that we don't know, living in faraway lands that we've never been to. It's not just people like that who have learned about Jesus being enough. I know a lot of people who maybe started off as fans of Jesus and became followers. And most of the time, it's been through times of great adversity, loss of jobs, loss of homes, loss of health, loss of a lot of things, that they came to understand that Jesus really is enough. Some of you may be in the process of discovering that right now because of the adversity that you're going through. And I'm grateful that there's a family here to walk through it with you. But I want to tell you a story that some of you may know and some of you may not. But one of my friends who I have great admiration and respect for, who I'm convinced has moved from being a fan to a follower to somebody who would say Jesus is enough, is a guy named Sean Dunn. Sean, not too many years ago, had life by the tail. Beautiful wife and family, good job, nice home, great friends, a church that they all loved. But then little by little, Sean started to lose it. He lost his drive, he lost his ambition. All of that resulted in him almost losing his family until one day he collapsed and they rushed him to the hospital. The long and short of it is Sean has had 2 massive brain surgeries, removing tumors like the size of a grapefruit. And both times when Sean went into surgery, he had no idea whether he would wake up looking into the eyes of family and friends, or if he would wake up looking into the eyes of Jesus. And as it turns out, both times when he woke up looking into the eyes of Jesus. It was just Jesus in and through his family and friends. But I think if you talk to Sean, he'd tell you that when you lose your health, when you have no control over the outcome of the surgery, it's times like that that you discover real quick whether Jesus is enough. And I'm convinced that in Sean's case, Jesus was more than enough. Well, I love the way that God uses times of adversity and challenge. I mean, I don't love the adversity and challenge themselves, but I love the way he uses them to forge in us a deeper faith like he did in Sean, and deeper community among ourselves, and how those become the touch points for us to be able to connect the grace of God to other hurting people. But let me take you back into the story in John chapter 6. And remember again now that Jesus, he's having this DTR conversation, the defining the relationship, with these huge crowds that are following him. And he decides to press in a little deeper. He takes them deeper and deeper into these truths, and the deeper and deeper he goes, the more and more uncomfortable they become. So I'm going to pick this up in John chapter 6, starting with verse 60. It says, many of his disciples said, this is very hard to understand. How can anyone accept it? And then it says, Jesus was aware that his disciples were complaining, so he said to them, does this offend you? Oh, I'm sorry. Let me just retract all of that. Maybe I can say this in a way that everybody likes and agrees with. No, actually, that's not what he says. He says, does this offend you? Then what will you think if you see the Son of Man ascend to heaven again? The Spirit alone gives eternal life. Human effort accomplishes nothing. Now, when he says that, he's not saying that we can't build houses and farm the land and so, that kind of stuff. He's saying that human effort can't accomplish anything that's going to last for eternity or bridge the chasm that separates us from a holy God. He goes on to say the Spirit alone gives eternal life. Human effort accomplishes nothing, and the very words I have spoken to you are spirit and life. He said, but some of you do not believe me, for Jesus knew from the beginning which ones did believe, and he knew who would betray him. Then he said, that is why I said that people can't come to me unless the Father gives them to me. And then in verse 66 it says, at this point, many of his disciples turned away and deserted him. And it's amazing to me that as the crowd starts to thin, because they were saying, like, I can't believe what this guy's saying. This is twisted. We don't understand it. This is disturbing. Jesus doesn't back down. If anything, he actually turns up the heat a little bit. And his purpose behind that was not to tick anybody off. Why would he want to do that? But neither was Jesus going to allow a crowd of fans to define who he was. He was not going to let them marginalize him and turn him into some kind of spiritual freak show. Jesus, the razzle-dazzle, miracle-working, crowd-feeding Messiah. That's not who he was. And he wasn't going to allow anybody to turn him into that. So you've got to see the scene now, because the crowds, man, they're like bailing. They are spilling out. And after pretty much everybody's gone, all the fans are gone, Jesus turns to his committed core of the 12. And he asks this question, which is recorded in verse 67. And he says, are you also going to leave? And you can't really tell for sure from the text the tone of voice that Jesus used. But my hunch is that when he said it, he was sad. And he was disappointed as he saw all these people walk away from him. And even though he was the Son of God, I think he asked that question out of a broken heart.